You know that many scholars of the ancient Near East believe nations were linked to spiritual powers. Now listen to what the Bible also says. According to the Bible, every nation on earth has been assigned a spiritual ruler, not a human ruler, a supernatural one, a divine being placed over the affairs of that nation with authority to shape its culture, its values, its spiritual atmosphere, and its relationship to God. This assignment happened at a specific moment in biblical history, the Tower of Babel, in approximately 2200 BC, and the beings assigned to those nations are still operating today. This is not a fringe theory. It is not speculation. It is drawn directly from Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8, Daniel chapter 10, Psalm 82, Isaiah chapter 14, Ezekiel chapter 28, and Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12. It was understood by the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the Jewish rabbinical tradition, and by the early church fathers. It is one of the most consistently attested ideas in the entire biblical worldview, and one of the least preached in contemporary Christianity. And when you see it clearly, it will permanently change how you understand world history, current events, national suffering, spiritual warfare, and the mission of the church. Stay with me for the full video, because by the end, you are going to understand something about the world you are living in that most believers have never been shown. To understand the divine assignment of nations, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of human civilization and trace the story from its origin point. Genesis chapter 1 through 11 tells the story of early humanity in broad strokes. God creates humanity in His image and places them in a garden with a commission: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The command is clear: spread out, populate the earth, extend the garden of God's presence across the whole world. What actually happened was the opposite. Adam and Eve chose autonomy over relationship in the garden. Cain murdered his brother Abel, and the violence of that choice spread through the human population with catastrophic momentum. By Genesis chapter 6, the corruption had become so comprehensive that God said every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The flood came. 8 people survived, and God started again. But the reset did not hold. Genesis chapter 9. God gives Noah the same commission He gave Adam: be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. Same command, same clarity: spread out, fill the earth. Genesis chapter 11 verse 1 through 4. The entire world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, the region of ancient Babylon in modern Iraq, and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Not be scattered. This was not an innocent urban planning project. This was a direct and deliberate refusal of God's commission. God said, "Fill the earth." Humanity said, "We will stay in one place and build our own empire." God said, "Spread out." Humanity said, "We will concentrate power and make a name for ourselves." The Tower of Babel was not primarily about architectural ambition. It was about human autonomy, asserting itself against divine commission for the third time in the biblical narrative, after the garden and after the flood. And this time, God responded with a judgment that restructured the entire governance of the human world. Genesis chapter 11 verse 5 through 9. God came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And God said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." That passage is straightforward enough on the surface. Languages confused, people scattered, city abandoned, end of story. But there is a layer underneath this event that most people have never seen, because it requires reading a passage in Deuteronomy that most Bible readers have passed over without understanding its full weight. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8. This is Moses writing approximately 1400 BC, and he is describing what happened at Babel in retrospect. The text in most modern translations reads, When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. But the older and more original reading, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript of Deuteronomy, which predates the Masoretic text by approximately 1,000 years, and reflected in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, reads differently. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Sons of God, not sons of Israel. This single textual difference is enormous. And the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript, discovered in 1947 and dated to approximately 150 BC, preserves what most scholars now believe is the more original reading. Sons of God, in the ancient Near Eastern context, shared by the biblical authors, refers to divine beings, members of what the Hebrew Bible calls the Divine Council, the heavenly court that surrounds God's throne. These are the beings who appear in Job chapter 1. When the sons of God presented themselves before the Lord, they are the beings referenced in Psalm 82 verse 1. When God presides in the great assembly and gives judgment among the gods, they are the divine beings. Paul references in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12, when he says, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." What Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8 is saying, in the reading preserved by the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that when God divided the nations at Babel, he assigned each nation to the governance of one of these divine beings. The number of nations corresponded to the number of divine beings available for assignment. And then, verse 9 delivers the counterpoint that gives the entire passage its theological weight. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Every other nation was assigned to a son of God. Israel was kept by God himself directly. This is the divine council worldview of the biblical authors laid out in its most explicit form, and it reframes everything that follows in the biblical narrative. If Deuteronomy 32 tells us what God did at Babel, assigning nations to divine beings, Psalm 82 tells us what happened next, and it is not a good story. Psalm 82 verse 1, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. The divine beings assigned to govern the nations had corrupted their assignment. Instead of governing their nations in alignment with God's character, with justice for the poor, protection for the vulnerable, truthful ordering of society, they had become the patrons of injustice. They were defending the wicked. They were showing partiality. They were allowing the vulnerable to be crushed, and God was putting them on trial for it. Verse 5, the gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Verse 6 through 7, I said you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. This is one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire Bible, and one of the least preached. God is addressing divine beings, members of his heavenly council who had been given authority over the nations, and telling them they have failed in their assignment and will be judged for it. Jesus himself quotes Psalm 82 verse 6 in John chapter 10 verse 34, in a context that confirms he understood these beings as real divine entities who had been given genuine authority and had genuinely failed. And Paul's entire framework of spiritual warfare in Ephesians chapter 6 is built on this same understanding. When he says our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers and authorities and powers of this dark world, he is not speaking metaphorically. He is describing the actual divine beings who were assigned to govern nations at Babel and who became corrupted in that governance and are now operating as the spiritual powers behind the systems of this world that oppose God's purposes. If Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82 give us the theological framework, the most vivid and specific window into how these national spiritual rulers actually operate in history is Daniel chapter 10. The year is approximately 536 BC. Daniel is in Babylon. He has been fasting and praying and mourning for 3 weeks, 21 days, seeking understanding from God about what the future holds for his people Israel. And then an angelic messenger arrives and says something that should permanently reframe how every believer understands prayer and spiritual warfare. Daniel chapter 10, verse 12 through 13. Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Read that carefully. Daniel prayed on day 1. God dispatched an angelic messenger on day 1. The answer left heaven on day 1. But the messenger did not arrive until day 21, because for 21 days he was resisted. The Greek word is detained, physically opposed, by the prince of the Persian kingdom. The Prince of Persia was not a human ruler. Cyrus the Great was the human ruler of Persia in 536 BC. The Prince of Persia was the divine being assigned to the Persian nation at Babel, who was now operating as a hostile spiritual power opposing God's purposes for his people. And the resistance was real enough that the archangel Michael, described in Daniel and in Jude as one of the chief princes, the commander of the armies of heaven, had to leave his own assignment and come to assist before the messenger could get through. This is not mythology. This is not allegory. Daniel understood it as a literal description of what was happening in the spiritual realm that corresponded to what was happening in the physical realm of Persian politics and Jewish exile. And then in verse 20, the messenger says something even more striking. He says, "Soon I will return to fight against the Prince of Persia, and when I go, the Prince of Greece will come." The Prince of Greece. The divine being assigned to Greece at Babel was already waiting in the wings in 536 BC for the moment when Greece would rise to world dominance, which happened approximately 200 years later when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 334 to 323 BC. The spiritual realm was already positioning itself for the political events of 2 centuries later. This is the biblical worldview. The nations of the earth have spiritual rulers operating in a dimension that human beings cannot directly observe. Those rulers are not omnipotent. Michael had to fight the Prince of Persia, and Daniel's prayer initiated the engagement. But they are real, and they have genuine influence over the spiritual atmosphere of the nations they govern. 2 of the most famous passages in the Old Testament give us the origin story of how the divine beings assigned to govern nations became corrupted in the first place. Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 15, is addressed on its surface to the king of Babylon. But the language rapidly transcends anything that could describe a human ruler. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, but you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. The description here, ascending to the heights, raising a throne above the stars of God, making oneself like the Most High, is language that describes a divine being in the heavenly realm, attempting to overthrow or equal God's position. No human king could ascend to the heavens or raise a throne above the stars of God. This is describing the spiritual power behind the throne of Babylon, a divine being whose ambition exceeded its assignment. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 17, delivers a parallel account addressed on its surface to the king of Tyre. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways, from the day you were created, till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. This being was in Eden. It was on the holy mountain of God. It was a guardian cherub, a high-ranking divine being in the immediate presence of God. It was perfect in its creation, and it fell through pride and violence and the corruption of its trading, its influence and authority, into wickedness. These two passages together describe the origin and the character of the divine beings who were assigned to the nations at Babel and who corrupted their governance. They were not created evil. They were created for service in God's heavenly council with genuine authority and genuine beauty. And they chose corruption. They chose the path of autonomous self-exaltation rather than submitted service. And that choice made them the hostile spiritual powers behind the empires and the systems and the nations that oppose God's purposes in the world. Now watch what happens when you read world history through this lens. Because the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis to Revelation, begins to make a different kind of sense. Egypt held Israel in slavery for 430 years. The 10 plagues were not primarily a confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. They were a direct assault on the gods of Egypt, on the divine beings assigned to Egypt, who had been operating as patrons of the system that enslaved God's people. Each plague targeted a specific Egyptian deity. The Nile, turning to blood, attacked Hapi, the god of the Nile. The plague of darkness attacked Ra, the sun god, the highest deity in the Egyptian pantheon. The death of the firstborn was a direct confrontation with Pharaoh himself, who was considered divine. Exodus chapter 12 verse 12 confirms this explicitly when God says, "I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt." Babylon conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the first temple in 586 BC. The divine being behind Babylon, described in Isaiah 14, was the power operating behind Nebuchadnezzar's throne. And yet, God used Babylon as his instrument of judgment on Israel, despite the corruption of the spiritual power behind it. God can use compromised instruments for righteous purposes without endorsing the instrument. Greece, under Alexander the Great, spread Hellenistic culture across the known world from 334 BC onward. The Prince of Greece, that Daniel's messenger warned was coming in 536 BC, arrived on schedule, and the Hellenistic culture it spread, the Greek language, the gymnasium, the philosophical framework of self-sufficiency and human reason as the highest authority, became the spiritual atmosphere that the gospel would later have to contend with in every city Paul visited. Rome crucified Jesus. The Roman Empire was the political instrument of the prince of the power of the air that Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 2. And yet, the same Roman road system, the same Pax Romana, the same Greek language spread by the earlier Greek Empire, all of it was repurposed by God as the infrastructure through which the gospel spread across the known world in the first century. This is the extraordinary thing about the biblical worldview of divine rulers over nations. The corrupted powers do not ultimately control the story. They operate within it. They influence it. They resist God's purposes with genuine force, but they cannot ultimately prevent those purposes from being accomplished. Daniel's prayer got through. The answer arrived. The angel said in verse 14 at the end of the chapter, "I am going to tell you what is written in the book of truth." What God had written would happen. The Prince of Persia could delay the messenger for 21 days, but could not prevent the word of God from arriving. Here is the moment the entire story was building toward. When Jesus arrived in the first century, he entered a world that was operating under the governance of corrupted divine beings. Every nation, Every empire, every system of power was shaped in part by spiritual rulers who had been given authority at Babel and had corrupted that authority into opposition to God. And Jesus systematically dismantled their authority, not through military conquest, not through political revolution, through the cross. Colossians chapter 2 verse 15. Having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The cross looked like defeat. It looked like the powers winning. The divine being behind Rome had its human instrument execute the Son of God, and in doing so, it overreached catastrophically. Because the death of Jesus was not the defeat of God's purposes, it was the accomplishment of them. And the resurrection was the public declaration that the authority of the corrupted powers over humanity had been broken. John chapter 12, verse 31. Jesus said, "Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out, the prince of this world." Jesus used that title 3 times in the Gospel of John. In chapter 12, verse 31, chapter 14, verse 30, and chapter 16, verse 11, each time referring to the divine being who had claimed sovereignty over the human world through the corruption introduced at Babel and deepened through every subsequent rebellion. And he said, it will be driven out. Not immediately driven out in the sense that its influence disappeared overnight. The battle described in Daniel chapter 10, the spiritual warfare described in Ephesians chapter 6, the resistance described throughout the New Testament, all of that continued and continues. But the legal authority of the corrupted powers over humanity was broken at the cross and confirmed at the resurrection. Psalm 82 verse 8. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. What Psalm 82 declared as a future hope. God reclaiming the nations from the corrupt divine beings assigned to them at Babel. Jesus began to accomplish at Calvary and commissioned the church to complete through the proclamation of the gospel to every nation. Here is the question that makes this entire theological framework immediately relevant to the world you are living in right now. If divine beings were assigned to govern the nations at Babel, and those beings corrupted their governance and became the spiritual powers behind the systems of this world, are they still operating? The New Testament answer is yes, but with a crucial qualification. They are operating as defeated powers, not undefeated ones. The language Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 6 is the language of an ongoing battle. Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes, but it is the language of a battle whose outcome has already been determined. The strong man has already been bound, according to Matthew chapter 12, verse 29. The victory has already been secured. What remains is the implementation of that victory across every nation and every sphere of human life. This is why the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 through 20 is framed the way it is. Jesus does not say, go into all the world and do your best. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations. All authority. The authority that was divided among the sons of God at Babel, the authority over the nations, has been reclaimed by Jesus through the cross and the resurrection. And he is now delegating that authority to the church to implement through the proclamation of the gospel in every nation on earth. Every time the gospel enters a new culture, a new community, a new nation, it is doing what Paul describes in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4 through 5. Demolishing strongholds, demolishing arguments, and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. The strongholds are not merely intellectual. They are the spiritual infrastructure of the corrupted powers that have shaped that culture's values, its worldview, its relationship to truth and to God. Daniel chapter 10, verse 20. After I have done this, I will return to fight against the Prince of Persia, and when I go, the Prince of Greece will come. But first, I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. The spiritual warfare continues. The princes of the nations resist. But what is written in the book of truth? The purposes of God for every nation, every people, every tongue will be accomplished. The messenger got through in 536 BC. The gospel got through in the 1st century. And the same God who kept his word then is keeping his word now. Here is where the story completes the circle. It began in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Verse 8 said, "When God divided the nations, he assigned them to the sons of God, and kept Israel for himself directly." Verse 9 said, "For the Lord's portion is his people." But the story does not end there, because the purpose of God keeping Israel as his direct inheritance was never to exclude the other nations from a relationship with him. It was to produce the one through whom the other nations would be reclaimed from the corrupt powers assigned to them. Romans chapter 15 verse 12. Isaiah says, "The root of Jesse will spring up, one who will arise to rule over the nations. In him the Gentiles will hope." The nations. Every nation that was assigned to a son of God at Babel. Every nation whose spiritual ruler had corrupted its governance and led it away from God. Every nation whose history had been shaped by the hostile spiritual powers behind its empires and its systems. All of them are the destination that the story of Israel was always moving toward. And Revelation chapter 7 verse 9 describes the destination. "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" Every nation, not some nations. Not the nations that had the most visible access to the gospel, not the nations that had the least resistance from their assigned spiritual powers. Every nation, every tribe, every people, every language. The beings assigned to govern those nations at Babel failed in their assignment. They chose corruption over service. They became the hostile powers behind the empires and the systems that oppose God's purposes. And yet the God who made those nations and loves those nations and has never stopped working toward those nations is going to accomplish what he always intended. Every nation standing before the throne. Now, let this land where it is supposed to land in your actual life. Take note. The spiritual atmosphere of the country you live in is not random. The values your culture promotes, the things your nation celebrates and tolerates and normalizes, the spiritual resistance you encounter when you try to live according to God's purposes, none of it is simply the product of human choices. There is a dimension to the spiritual environment of every nation that is shaped by the divine being operating over it. And that being may be corrupted. It may be actively working against the purposes of God in that nation. This is not an excuse for passivity. It is an invitation to informed intercession. Daniel understood the spiritual powers operating over Persia, and he prayed with a precision and a persistence that engaged those powers directly. He did not just pray generic prayers. He fasted for 21 days with focused intentionality for a specific outcome, for a specific people, in a specific national context. And his prayer initiated a spiritual engagement in the heavenly realm that moved the history of nations. Many of us have been praying for our nations as though the problems are only political, economic, and social. We have been applying human solutions to spiritual problems. We have been debating policies when the real battle is in a dimension that policies cannot reach. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. Does not say our struggle is against corrupt politicians or failing economies or broken social systems. It says our struggle is against rulers and authorities and powers of this dark world and against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The human problems are real, but they are symptoms of a spiritual reality that only spiritual engagement can address. The question is whether you will pray like Daniel, whether you will engage the spiritual dimension of the national problems around you with the same seriousness and persistence that you bring to the visible human dimension. Whether you will understand that your prayers are not bouncing off the ceiling, but are initiating engagements in a spiritual realm that you cannot see, but that is more real than the physical world it governs. Psalm 82, verse 8. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. Every nation assigned to a son of God at Babel. Every nation whose spiritual ruler corrupted its governance. Every nation whose history has been shaped by hostile spiritual powers. Every nation represented in the great multitude of Revelation 7. All of them are God's inheritance. Not the inheritance of the princes assigned to them, not the property of the hostile powers operating behind their systems. God's inheritance, given to Jesus at the resurrection, according to Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. Being implemented through the church according to the Great Commission, moving toward the completion described in Revelation chapter 11, verse 15. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. Every prince of every nation will be judged, as Psalm 82 declared. Every hostile power operating behind every human system will face the verdict that the cross already rendered. And every nation, every tribe, every tongue, every people will stand before the throne. The question that should follow you out of this video is this: if divine beings were assigned to govern the nations at Babel and corrupted their governance and became the hostile powers operating behind the systems of this world, and if the cross of Jesus broke their authority and the Great Commission is the implementation of that broken authority across every nation on earth, what exactly is the spiritual dimension of the national problems you have been trying to solve with only human solutions? Father, you are the Most High over all the nations. Every prince, every power, every ruler of this dark world operates within limits you have set and under a judgment you have already rendered at the cross. We pray for our nations not as people who are subject to the powers operating over them, but as people who carry the authority of the one who broke those powers at Calvary. Rise up, O God, and judge the earth. Let your kingdom come in every nation. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And use us as instruments of the gospel, that is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. In Jesus' name, Amen. If this opened something in you, drop a comment below. Share this with someone who has been asking why the world is the way it is. And subscribe to Bethel TV. We go deep so you can live free.